Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
All right, let's begin. Welcome to everyone who's joined the conference in the CSIS Online event. My name is Scott Miller. I'm a senior advisor at CSIS. Today's conference concerns the release of a new report called Toward a New Global Trade Framework. The report is being released under the auspices of the CSIS Commission on Affirming American Leadership. Work of this commission began about 18 months ago under the leadership of Ambassador Charlene Barshefsky, Senator Bill Brock, and Fred Smith, the chairman of FedEx Express. These three co-chairs were joined by 17 other commissioners, as well as CSIS experts, to provide the content that we've generated over the past 18 months. In September of 2020, the commission released an economic forecast, the world in the year 2030, looked at both the US and the global economy and the US position in the economy. In October, we released two other substantive papers, the first on workforce development and the second on the innovation economy. All these are available at csis.org. Today, we're launching the remaining paper, which presents a new approach to the rules-based trading system. Thanks all for joining. We'd like to introduce the paper with a short video. I'll see you at the end.
For nearly 75 years, the United States has led and maintained the global rules-based trading system, a system that has provided global opportunities for American firms, workers, and consumers, while deepening the relationship between the United States and its trading partners. Now, the system is under pressure, and U.S. trade leadership is wavering. Two conflicting economic systems are beginning to clash: a Western-led, market-driven model based on the rule of law, and an authoritarian, state-driven model championed by China. And change is accelerating. The global trade rulebook was not designed to take on new challenges like the digital economy, climate change, and unfair non-market economic policies. Old challenges, like ensuring that trade benefits workers and not just those at the top, are more pressing than ever. The three main functions of the World Trade Organization, negotiation, dispute settlement, and monitoring, are quickly eroding. These challenges are urgent. Left unanswered, they will diminish U.S. economic and geopolitical influence. The United States and its like-minded partners must revitalize the global rules-based trading system. Doing so will require reinvigorated U.S. trade leadership. The Commission has developed a strategy for the United States to reorient its trade policy for the 21st century and lead the reform of the global rules-based trading system. There are three core parts of the strategy: the creation of a new trade compact among like-minded advanced market economies, a pragmatic approach to WTO reform, and an update to U.S. trade laws. First, the compact would supplement, not supplant, the WTO by acting as a forum for ambitious, like-minded countries to quickly reach robust agreements that could then be proposed at the WTO. Three areas should form the compact's initial agenda: establishing a positive rulebook for 21st century economy issues like digital trade and trade's role in combating climate change, establishing a common approach to countering unfair, non-market economic policies, and launching discussions on current issues in need of improvement, like labor rules, investment, and services. Second, pragmatic WTO reform led by the United States should include reform to the dispute settlement system and restoration of the appellate body, a new approach to flexibilities for developing countries and agreements, and penalties for failure to meet basic transparency obligations. Third, the United States should update its trade laws to allow for faster action to protect industries from unfair trade practices like harmful foreign subsidies, dumping, and circumvention of trade remedies. And the United States should revive a China-specific safeguard, so it has a tool to counter Chinese overcapacity without causing collateral damage. These recommendations, while not exhaustive, chart a course for a bold, nimble, and calibrated U.S. trade policy necessary to lead the global rules-based trading system into the 21st century.
that as an introduction, let me make two comments for our audience. First, if you're interested in reading the full report, you should have a link to it. Frankly, if you were invited and confirmed your attendance at this event, you probably already received an email from CSIS, which has a link to the PDF file that has the complete report. If that didn't happen for some reason, which these days you're never sure, but if it didn't, you can go to csis.org. The report's available online. That's the first comment. The second is, we're happy you joined us and we want to hear from you today. So if you have questions or comments as the discussion unfolds, please put your question or comment in the chat. And one of the CSIS staff will be monitoring the chat, and we'll do our best to get the questions that are most on your mind posed to our three panelists. We have three outstanding panelists today. Two of them have been co-chairs of the coalition all along and have put in the 18 months of work to justify their presence here, and we're delighted to have them with us. Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky is Senior International Partner at WilmerHale and former U.S. Trade Representative from 1997 to 2001. Senator Bill Brock is a CSIS Counselor and Trustee. He's a former U.S. Trade Representative, former Secretary of Labor, and former U.S. Senator, Congressman, and Senator from the state of Tennessee. The third panelist is my colleague, Bill Reinsch. Bill is a senior advisor and the chair of the Scholl Chair he's the Scholl Chair in International Business. Sorry, that's a mouthful. But Bill's the panelist here, and a vitally important one because he led the thinking and basically is the principal craftsman of the report we're putting out today. Bill and his colleagues have done a great job with this in taking feedback from our three co-chairs and the 17 other commissioners and making sure we got a proposal that is both salient and timely for U.S. leadership in the global economy. With that as introductions, what I'd like to do is begin with Bill. And Bill, as the key draftsman, can you take us through the ideas that are expressed in this paper, how you came to them, and why they are the right thing to do now?
The video, I think, lays out the rationale. The system is under stress. Institutions are under stress. And you can see politically in the United States that trade has become controversial. It takes the blame, rightly or wrongly, for bad things that are happening in the economy. And what the commission tried to do was to address those issues looking forward rather than backward. We began by trying to understand where the global economy was likely to be in 2030, which was the initial paper that we put out, and then examine the questions of what the United States needed to do to maintain its position of global leadership 10 years from now. And Scott mentioned there are already papers out on workforce development, because we concluded that getting our workforce in shape, really agile enough to deal with a rapidly changing economy, was a critical element. Second paper was on innovation. And this one is on trade. And we were trying to figure out how to sustain the movement to globalization, but in a way that restores political support for it and addresses the concerns of many, particularly in our country, that it's not benefiting everybody, but is benefiting only a select few. Where we ended up was with the three proposals mentioned in the video. The primary one is the idea of a trade compact. And this is essentially the thought that countries that want to move farther, faster in developing a rules-based trading system should be able to do so. That the WTO, which is a consensus-based organization of 164 countries, has not been able to step up and move forward because of various countries for different reasons, depending on the issue, who are prepared to block progress. So what we think would be a good idea would be to get like-minded, non-authoritarian, for the most part, countries that want to pursue a more ambitious agenda together and have them talk about doing it. And in doing so, they would look at new issues that the WTO has not really addressed, climate change being a big one, digital trade being probably a larger one, and an old problem that has become much more severe, the problem of non-market economies. and the challenges they pose to economies that operate according to market principles. So we have designed the compact to give them a very broad agenda, and I think we'll probably talk about the agenda in more detail later on. The members would get together and see if they can make progress in these areas. If they do, that's good, and they will operate according to the agreements that they reach. But it's not a substitute for the WTO. The idea is that when they reach agreement, they can go back to the WTO with what they've done and try to enlist the other countries there with what we think would be a more successful approach. So the second pillar of this, WTO reform, is also very much a part of what's being recommended. People, I think, in this audience are familiar with the WTO issues, and we've got a number of recommendations that relate to addressing the problems that actually both the Obama administration and the Trump administration identified: a dispute settlement process that is broken, countries that don't meet their obligations by providing the necessary transparency and information about what they're doing, and countries that insist on being treated as developing countries long past the point where they were developing. These are all issues that need to be addressed, and we've got some suggestions for doing that. And then the final pillar was to not to forget our own toolbox, and recognizing that there are unfair trade practices that exist. We know that. We have rules to deal with them, not new rules. Some of our rules are, the Anti-Dumping Act, for example, is 100 years old this year. Have an anniversary party. What we've learned, though, over the last 20 years is that while they work, they don't work fast enough. And if you're a victim of an unfair trade practice, you want to get relief, which, by the way, is WTO sanctioned relief, but you want to get it before you're broke. And we have a number of recommendations that are designed essentially to speed up the process by allowing or fleshing out the right of our regulators to look at threat of injury and not just fact of injury. To establish fact, you have to wait for the harm to be done. To establish threat, you don't. So you can move the process along much more quickly. And we have also have recommendations that deal with countries that attempt to circumvent the rules by shipping things through third countries and engage in other fraudulent activities in order to disguise the nature of their products or the origin of their products in order to avoid tariffs. So it's a big list and a long list, but I think a comprehensive one that I hope will get the trading system moving back in the right direction.
Thank you, Bill. And as we start the discussion, I'd like to pose the first question to Ambassador Barshevsky. Ambassador Barshevsky, let's talk about President Biden's incoming team and their priorities, if we could. We have, I think that it's fair to say that the administration plans less focus on bilaterals and more on action in concert and multilateral action. Given what we're proposing is, what do you think is going to be the reaction? How do you think this will strike President Biden and his key advisors? And does it solve is it a solution to any problems they think they have? Start there.
First of all, let me just say it's a pleasure to be here and to be with my co-chair, Senator Bill Brock, and of course with you, Scott, and our principal drafter, Bill Reinsch. First of all, if I might say one thing as an add-on to the very, very excellent summary Bill provided, and that is the report is not intended to be all-inclusive of the trade actions that the Commission believes the Biden administration should consider. So, for example, we don't go into any detail at all on TPP, but it's fair to say that the Commission believes the Biden administration should find a way back to the TPP, which is viewed as critical for the US presence in Asia, not only as a matter of trade and market access, but as a geopolitical and strategic matter. So this report really was intended to assist the new administration in those areas where there seems to be a desire to potentially move forward. You've heard the administration, for example, talk about a concert of democracies or a concert of the larger nations. And our compact is designed to address not only the desire of the administration to work with like-minded countries, in this case, the advanced industrial economies, but to do so in a way that can spur additional benefit over time to the multilateral system, to which I believe the Biden administration is equally committed. In addition, of course, both political parties have long rallied around trade enforcement and trade tools, the Biden administration no less. And so the report recommends an updating of those tools, as Bill has outlined, and a desire to make these tools more robust, more user-friendly, and for the first time, timely in their use. And then, of course, we have all of the new issues which intersect not only with trade, but with many other areas. And those really are climate change, and to perhaps a slightly lesser extent, because it's not as new, labor-related issues. And here again, these are areas we believe could have a plurilateral bent to them through the compact, but also will be reinforced by the papers the Commission has put out on innovation, which encompasses climate change as well and relevant technologies, and workforce development. So we think in total, the trade report that we're issuing today and the reports on innovation and workforce development act as a whole and are quite complementary, we believe, to what the Biden administration has at least indicated it would want to consider.
Thank you for that. Senator Brock, I'd like to turn to you to talk about U.S. leadership, primarily because you're the rare commissioner who has put his name on a ballot. and that makes a difference. Holding elected office is a different thing. It's somewhat special in this country. There's a limited number of humans who have done that in our nation's history. And I think it gives you a unique perspective. Given the state we're in as Americans, including in last November, 74 million of us voting for an explicitly America First policy, but that policy not prevailing. So what's your view, and how does U.S. leadership stand up today in our current domestic and particularly electoral environment?
I don't know where you want to start with an easy question. Let's be very candid. I've never seen the Congress as divided as it is. It is bitterly partisan. It is mean-spirited. And the good ones are leaving. We just lost by announced resignation. Rob Portman, who was the USTR and who brought real thoughtful approach to the issues. Others are doing the same thing. So to be fair, they're trying to deal, as will the president, deal with a radically different world from what we had 20, 30 years ago. China is really changed the landscape. The collapse of the World Trade Organization is real and substantive. The climate issue is driving a lot of conversation. And our workforce is simply not meeting the challenge of a knowledge-based global economy. Our education system has failed, and we're doing almost nothing to address that. The business is having to carry the whole burden there. So if you want to look at whether there is a chance for us to pull some coherent policy together, it almost has to come out of the administration because the Congress is unable to focus. And I don't see that changing it for a while anyway. And it is really important that we look at the complex of these issues. in a more fundamental and more structured way. And that's going to take some time. We've done real damage to our international relations. We have a very damaged domestic circumstance with divisions that are hard to heal. It's going to take some leadership, and we at the moment have not identified the focal point of that.
That's fair. Fair as a presentation of today's challenge. Do you have hope that we can get our arms around this? I mean, the United States is still a really highly innovative, high-performing economy that is admired by much of the world.
Well, we are the most productive people in the world. We are the most productive economy in the world. We have the most creative economic engine in the world. And we have a very wonderfully well-developed political system. The problem is in pulling all these together and creating a weave that allows us to do what we're trying to do with this report, which is to establish the role of the United States back in leadership. Without us, there's nobody else. There is no other country that's going to provide the leadership for a world system that we have done and can do today.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you who are putting questions in the chat. I'm trying my best to keep up with you. We have several about specifically TPP, but more generally about regional agreements. While the move away from bilaterals is not a surprise, the move toward regionals is not part of the paper. Bill Reinshore, Ambassador Barshevsky, do you want to talk about regional agreements or regional efforts as part of this program?
Go ahead, Charlene.
No, Bill, your turn.
Well, I think the premise of the commission was that it's increasingly difficult to produce broad multilateral agreements for reasons that have been alluded to and that I think most of the people here know. And you know what sort of de facto Plan B has become the negotiation of regional, bilateral, or plurilateral agreements. I don't think anybody would say that's the best option. I think that all the three of us, I think, would all agree that the best option would be comprehensive multilateral agreements like we've tried to have in the past. That doesn't seem to be viable. So rather than do nothing and let the system further disintegrate, we're recommending Plan B. Our plan, though, is not a regional one. It's not focused on geography. It's focused on like-mindedness. You know, we're looking to talk to countries that share the U.S. view about the supremacy of rule of law in the trading system and the supremacy of market economics in the trading system. And those are the sort of the two pillars of the idea. And the thought is that those countries could get together and tackle some of the issues that that the WTO has been unable to tackle multilaterally. Digital trade being a good example. It's kind of a new, I mean, it's not new, but it was not really an issue in 1994 when the Uruguay round was negotiated. It's a much bigger deal now. We don't have rules that have kept up with it. We need to do that. I think there are authoritarian countries in particular that have a very different view about digital trade than we do. So we're trying to work with like-minded partners to produce as much of a standard as we can. Charlene, now it's your turn.
No, Bill, I think you've said it very, very well. The compact, as Bill said, is intended to bring developed like-minded nations together. It is not intended to be exclusionary over time, but instead would develop criteria for membership. But its core touchstones are really what sets it apart, I think, from regional arrangements generally, and even, frankly, bilateral arrangements. And that is, the core touchstones are market-based economics, transparency, rule of law, independent judiciary, and notions to some extent of reciprocity. So this is a very different basis on which to construct a group, if you will. It is intended to be a group that would be constructive. That is to say, no spoilers need apply. And it is a group that, in pulling together this intersection of global trade, new issues, greater focus on jobs, really challenges the rest of the world to come join and to essentially rebuild the multilateral system from the bottom up. It's impossible to negotiate agreements in the WTO. It is simply impossible. We only need look at how long the Doha round has been on life support, how long the Trade and Services Agreement has been on life support, and many, many other areas. Even the Environmental Goods and Services Agreement, with climate change looming, is stuck. There is nothing that moves because there's no common view, no common agenda, no common intention, no common resolution. So how do we get past that impasse and yet support the multilateral system in the hopes that it can be revitalized? And that, we believe, is something that the Compact could be able to do.
Thank you. One of the joys of online moderating is you wind up once in a while with a commissioner in the comments section. Thanks to Laura Tyson. Laura raises two, we thank her for her service as a commissioner. She was a great pleasure to work with, but she has two questions about American Achilles heels in international negotiation. The first one being Buy America. The second being the use of unilateral sanctions, both of which tend to make building coalitions difficult. Ambassador Barshevsky, Senator Brock, you've both been negotiators for the United States. How would you respond?
Well, I'll take on the unilateral sanctions. I think the thought that we can enforce the rules by ourselves is crazy. If we're going to have a rules-based system, it requires people of like mind to work together to achieve that. That's the purpose of this entire conversation around the compact that we've put forward. The thought that we can engage with China without any allies is crazy. All we're doing is pitting these two very different economic and political systems against each other. The prospects of that being positive are de minimis. The thought that we could apply US trade law unilaterally and use sanctions on the basis of, like 232, where we accuse Canada of being a threat to our national security, is crazy. We really have to have a broader approach that engages the people, as Charlene said, who think alike, but who have similar systems and similar commitments to work together. And that's when you begin to see some results.
And I would say on the question of Buy America, just as a technical matter, of course, virtually all countries have equivalents to Buy America. This is not unique to America. We can run down countries in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America. You'll see similar kinds of programs. And because these programs involve procurement by the government, as opposed to procurement by individuals, most countries take an exception from their WTO obligations, which allows these individual programs to move forward without constraint of international rules. Now, in order to loosen the system up, of course, we have the Government Procurement Code in the WTO. It has always had a limited number of signatories because it basically opens up government procurement to other signatories of the code and therefore to their companies. There are even still some exclusions there particularly high-level national security-related procurements, but the procurement agreement itself took a big step toward loosening the binds of these various systems. So we don't have any inside information on what the Biden administration might do in the context of the government procurement agreement obligations, which we would hope and expect the US would continue to follow. With respect to the rest of Buy America, I think it's fair to say that the United States can take the actions it wishes to take without undue concern about WTO rules, since those practices were already accepted from WTO obligations.
Thank you. Bill Reinsch, I think a couple of questions here. There are several in the chat on this theme, and that has to do with how would you describe or how characterize like-mindedness? Who are the economies who might be most expected to be part of this endeavor in the compact? And then the sort of a secondary question on that is there a vision for outreach to, say, developing countries who are ambitious about reform as being, so is this a rich countries club or a democracy club, or how would you characterize the compact in your view? And what's the outreach to others?
Well, it wasn't intended to be just a rich countries club. I think the idea was we would see who would be interested, and it would be open to countries that were, ambitious, and but we would expect them to be countries that had adopted the principles I articulated earlier, that they believe in rule of law, and that they're market economies. We deliberately did not attempt to provide a list or get into the question of who would be an appropriate country. I think partly because it's speculative, and partly because we didn't want the debate to sort of spiral down into, well, they won't fit, and why didn't you say so and so, and it gets into a debate about individual countries, which is not constructive. Clearly, I think a lot of countries that are developed, or I think to use the questioner's term, rich countries, I think would find this interesting. But I can think of a good number of developing countries that I think are similarly interested in developing a trading system that operates according to clear, consistent, transparent rules, and that reaffirms market economics. That's worked for a lot of countries, including developing countries. So I think it's, I think it would be a more diverse group than people think, but I don't want to get into the idea of naming particular countries. That's a dangerous territory.
Scott, if you wouldn't mind, may I add something to what Bill just said?
Please.
And that is, let's be clear, the compact is not the only thing we believe the US should be doing. And compact nations is not the only group of nations we believe the US should have interchange with, or do agreements with, or have discussions with. There are an infinite number of forums that either exist or can be created. The compact is one, and we have focused on this because it has not only a function of reinforcing a market-based economic model, but also has the prospect of helping to rebuild the WTO. But there are many other forums that exist, some of which might be able to serve the same function as the compact for the United States. I'd add one other point, and that is, let's also remember, trade is not the only way the US interacts with other countries or groups of countries. You have existing international institutions. It could be NATO, it could be the OECD, it could be the OAS, or any one of a number of other existing broad-based or somewhat broad-based institutions. You have other formats for negotiation with countries. For example, the US may well pursue a digital agreement in the context of the compact, but there is no reason on earth why the US shouldn't also pursue a digital economy agreement with the TPP countries, since in the TPP are many of the concepts the US had pushed forward with respect to the digital economy. So there are many activities and groups that can proceed simultaneously. I think we want to be careful not to leave the impression that it's the compact or nothing. And if you're in it, then you're in it. And if you're out, you are really out in the cold. That's absolutely not the case and not the intention.
An excellent point. And you remind me that the report also makes the point that we intend to recommend the United States remain an active member of the WTO and continue to build the disciplines there to the extent the WTO can actually perform in ways that we've all expected it to for the last 20 years on things like transparency and notification and even repairing the dispute settlement. So you're right, there's more to the proposal than the compact. There's also a lot more to US policy. Now, if I could, the elephant in the chat room is, unsurprisingly, China. A number of people have brought it up. Obviously, the video at the start did note the fact that China presents a contrary view to the system, which makes it difficult to reconcile. But among the questions are things like, so what happens when the compact gets rolling and China starts to interfere or block? What is the thinking on how to deal with the existing US-China tensions through this method?
Can I take a whack at it?
Please do.
The challenge, maybe a better put, the problem that the WTO has faced since China's accession to the WTO is that we've got two fundamentally different systems. And the rules that we developed over 40 years since the Bretton Woods Agreement simply aren't applicable with the state-owned enterprise, which so characterizes a lot of the Chinese approach. If you're going to deal with the collapse of the WTO, which I think we've seen, partly because of the unanimous requirement in terms of votes, but partly because the whole system was set up for market-based economies, and we don't have a 100% market-based economy. The largest threat is non-market. And if you're going to deal with that, if you're going to construct a rule-based system, then the compact that we're suggesting offers us a chance to have people of like minds work together with an independent judicial system in each country that can rule on the rule of law and maintain some coherence and approach. If you do that, then others are going to want to be a part of that. As that grows, there becomes increasingly pressure on China to think maybe just maybe they could play a more constructive role about being part of something like that. I don't know how else you can do it. I don't believe that you can have a frontal assault. I don't think that works with the Chinese. And frankly, we need to give them a reason to work with us. And I don't think we're doing that very well right now.
That's a great point. And Senator Brock, while you're thinking about cooperation and building coalitions, how does the domestic coalition get repaired? We have a question in the chat from our great friend Wendy Cutler, who sends her respects and regards, but also asks, how do we prevent the TPP effect? Wendy, of course, gave numerous pints of blood negotiating the TPP for the United States, only to have it become sort of an orphan politically on a domestic policy basis. What do we need to do to build the domestic support at the same time as building this international coalition?
That's a fair question. I think the most obvious answer is that we need very strong leadership from the executive branch that says this is in the interest of the United States. To date, we have not seen that. We have not seen an effort to say to labor, management, education, the whole panoply of the forces that compose the US as the most incredible economy in the world. we have not been able to pull those into a coherent approach. TPP was an opportunity, and it was tragic that we have walked away from it, because TPP was sort of the thing we're talking about with the compact. It was an effort to get countries together of like mind who are willing to make obligations that would advance the cause of each of us, but all of us as a group. We desperately need some more examples of things that we can take to the Congress and say, these are things that your constituency would like and that will advantage them and advance their interests. That's why we're talking about innovation. We're talking about climate. We're talking about labor management. We're talking about workforce development. All of those things can be political positives. They just are not being presented as such yet.
Makes sense.
Scott, just add one thing to Wendy's very good question on TPP effect. And that is, there's an awful lot that the US can do without fast track.
Yeah.
Because much of what we're talking about here has more to do with US regulation than it does with US legislation. I'm not suggesting that anyone thumbed their nose at Congress. You do that at your peril. But what I am suggesting is that one of the reasons TPP became so hotly politicized is that members would have to vote on it. Sometimes issues of trade are not inherently political or politicized. Rather, they become so in part because of what the demand is on the particular legislator. If what you're talking about are altering regulations or thinking about new regulations, whether it's on climate change or the digital economy, or on persuading countries to enforce their own labor laws, there may be ways to move forward to not engender the kind of political animus that sometimes arises, and make progress on issues that actually have bipartisan support at this juncture. So I wouldn't think that all trade agreements are doomed or trade talks are doomed to the TPP effect. I'd add one other comment on TPP, of course. It came too late. You don't pass major pieces of trade legislation like that 2 months before a national election. And so one of the problems with it, apart from various disagreements, is that it simply came too late in the cycle.
But that was our fault.
Yeah, I agree. Oh yeah, no, that was the fault of the U.S.
Yeah,
that was the fault of the U.S. Yeah.
Well, there's one more thread in the comments section I want to pull on, and I'd like to do it with Bill Reinsch if I could. And that is Europe. Europe is an obvious partner in some of this, but keeps showing up in the comments section as what my kids would call a frenemy. Right? They have contrary interests. There's a note. Someone noted that the Europe engaged with China on an investment treaty right at the beginning of right after basically the week that President Biden was sworn in. That they have been reluctant to cooperate, and they tend to be a major contrary force to U.S. initiatives in Geneva. Bill Reinsch, could you talk about your view of sort of where's their basis for action in concert with Europe, and what are the realities that we have to think through?
Yeah, that's an important thread, and I think it's going to be reflected in a lot that goes on this year in trade policy. I think in many respects, this is going to be a year of Europe. Because I think the Biden administration is going to be focused on rebuilding that relationship, which has suffered a lot in the last 4 years, and not just in the trade area. I think they'll begin with NATO, which was constantly under attack by the previous president. But trade is an important element, and the EU has thrown out some initiatives. They've invited us to participate in a transatlantic trade and technology council, which has some antecedents that never ended up being as successful as they started out hoping to be, but the time seems to be right to engage. And I think you're right that from a standpoint of building the compact. There's a lot of good targets there. I think what we're seeing, and we saw it in the debate with the comprehensive agreement on investment that questioner mentioned, and also in this growing conversation in Europe about strategic autonomy, which seems to mean a term that seems to mean different things to different people in Europe. It isn't entirely clear to me how Europe wants to position itself. I think the American view has been, and I think will be in this administration, that we face a common challenge from China and really other non-market economies, and that the challenge is very large, very important, and not one that either of us can take on our own, and that we are both best off working together to try to confront the challenge. The other view, which seems to be held on the part of some Europeans, is that Europe should be a third force, independent of China and independent of the United States, and chart its own path. I think that's probably not going to be a successful course of action. When I hear that part of the conversation, I'm always reminded of the Ben Franklin comment during the revolution, and we must all hang together lest we all hang separately. I think the better course for Europe is to hang with us, but they're not there yet, and they're coming around. But I think they really have to make that decision for themselves. And I think our administration, will point out what we have in mind and what we think is the right course. But ultimately, Europe has to decide where it wants to go. I think their interests lie with ours, and I think, frankly, China's provocative actions in non-trade areas, in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, in Hong Kong, its threats to Taiwan, its aggressive actions in the South China Sea, these are pushing Europe in our direction. So I think ultimately we get there, but there needs to be a lot more thought and debate within the EU first.
And if I may just interject, I agree very much with that, but we don't talk near enough about our relationships in the Pacific. We have allies that are of fundamental importance and consequence, Japan, Korea, or in Southeast Asia, that can be drawn into a coalition that would have a great deal more positive consequence. Europe is going to find its own way, and it's going to take some time. I think that's going to be something we don't have. I think we got to work more quickly, more effectively. And that means engaging on both sides, Atlantic and Pacific.
That's an excellent point. And I note that in the chat, there's many of the people who are participating in the conference have the same concerns and the same estimate of how much work it will take for us to get the political consensus rebuilt and advancing in the country. So I appreciate the fact that Senator Brock, you and Ambassador Barshevsky both spent time talking about that. I would note that as the whole commission dealt with that issue, we had intended to talk about trade as a commission, and we wound up producing 3 reports. We produced reports on workforce development and on technology because they were so core to rebuilding domestic capability and the domestic confidence to move forward into the international arena. So there's I think I don't want to understate the specifics in the comment section, but there's a general understanding of the challenge we face. What I would like to do is turn to one last question, and it has to do with climate change or the green energy agenda. It's clearly a priority for the Biden administration. It's clearly something that intersects with the trade system, and where the trading system has had its struggles. Dealing with issues of the commons have not always been straightforward. If you look at the 20-year-long negotiation on fishery subsidies, that's gone nowhere. So let's switch in conclusion to the number of questions on the green agenda, both from the Biden administration and how the compact might advance these issues in a way that would help the global commons. Ryan, you want to take a first shot?
So Well, I'm not sure what the question was, but
Sorry, I was totally unclear. My bad as a moderator. The notion is green energy is a priority for the Biden administration and a priority for the planet. How do trade rules through the compact or some other way get developed so we deal with this in a constructive manner?
and I think we've had difficulty dealing with global commons issues, and what there was. I've been trying to deal with some of the Q&A as well while this has been going on, and some of them have sort of reflected. How do you deal with global commons issues in an era when countries are focused exclusively on their national interest, and that has kind of always been a challenge in trade because it's easy to determine your short-term interests, particularly when you're talking about tariff negotiations. It's a challenge, and it takes global leadership to get countries to look beyond their short-term interest and to look at the long-term interest of the planet, and to understand that they have a stake in the outcome. We've had the president for the last 4 years that didn't want to do that and didn't believe it was a problem. We now have a president that thinks it's a priority. So I think you're going to have leadership, and that has an effect, not in 1 week, but cumulatively over time. I think you're going to see more people realizing that this is something that needs to be dealt with. And there are several issues that can be dealt with at hand. I mean, the easiest one actually is to restart and conclude negotiations on the environmental goods agreement, which we address in the paper, and actually converted into an environmental goods and services agreement. It made a lot of progress, and then it foundered in 2016 over some last-minute demands, largely by China. And then under the Trump administration, it just sort of went on life support for 4 years. But it makes sense to go back to that and try to bring that to a conclusion. I think the 4 years have changed thinking in some areas, and we ought to be able to get that done. The more complicated one, which is the real trade issue, I think, for climate, is border adjustment measures. Because what you get domestically, when you start talking about what can we do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions here, or shift away from fossil fuels here, et cetera, is industries say that, well, if we do that, it'll be expensive, and it'll harm our ability to compete with products from countries that have not done that. And they're right about that. And that's why we have a debate about making adjustments at the border to reflect the carbon content, for example, of imports, or the failure of other countries to either meet their Paris Agreement obligations, or to reduce carbon content of their goods. That's going to be a long, difficult, complicated negotiation. And I'm worried, on the one hand, that we won't do anything. I'm also worried that some regions, the EU is a good example, might move forward on its own without a global consensus. And that, I think, is likely to lead to retaliation and not the most optimal outcome. So again, it's a question of global leadership and trying to get everybody together. The idea of the compact is, let's start with the people that get it and want to do that, and see what we can agree to, and then let's try to expand the universe from there.
Could I just add, Scott? I think there are two issues that we think of as traditional trade issues, but which are vastly complicated in the case of climate change and in the case of COVID. Mm-hmm. So in the case of climate change, of course, the question of allowable subsidies for green goods. Do you want to favor green goods? Do you want to be able to allow governments to pour money into green goods? It's not an easy question. There are countries that have the money to do that, and there are many countries that don't have the money to do that. And the country that has the most money to do that is China. So this becomes a very complicated issue. On the COVID side, think about the resurrection of industrial subsidies, industrial policy, as whole economies are being reshaped because of the COVID pandemic. And entire swaths of the economy will change, and some parts of it will completely disappear. Well, should countries be able to engage under acceptable rules in providing industrial policy, industrial subsidies to take care of all of that dislocation? And how do we think about that in the context of the pandemic? So you have these two kinds of traditional trade issues, but in the context of areas with potential catastrophic consequences to humanity. How do we think about that? So I think there's a lot here to be discussed. Certainly compact countries should discuss these kinds of issues in working groups, but also the OECD, many other entities that exist, and perhaps in the WTO. These are discussions I think very much worth having.
We have the largest question and less than a minute to solve it. Can't be done. We need another hour, Scott. But the fundamental point about this entire report is that by forming a coalition of like-minded countries, we give ourselves the tools with which we can advance the common purpose of a global improvement. I think climate would be a fundamental part of that conversation, and that's important for all of us.
Well, thank you, Senator Brock, for that succinct, basically, benediction on our work and the work we have going ahead. Let me specifically thank the panelists. It's been a wonderful hour. Let me apologize to those in the comment session I didn't get to. There's one of me and 300 of you, and you're all smart. So in any case, please stay in touch. Please download and read the report. We welcome your comments going forward. As both Ambassador Barshevsky and Senator Brock said in their closing comments, we got a lot more work to do. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for joining, and look forward to your comments and suggestions in the future. Have a great day.